Well, good morning, everybody. You doing well today? Thought out, getting there, everything else. Excellent, excellent. Listen, I want to remind you before we get underway that we do have notes in the app. If you'd like to follow along, it has some of the passage stuff that we're going to be looking at today. In the last service, we managed to traverse the entire narrative of human history in about 30 minutes. Pretty good. So we'll see what we do this service. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pray. We're going to get underway with that, and then we're going to get right into the text of the Gospel of Luke. And so let's pray together. Jesus, I thank you for the fact that you love to write your story into the brokenness of human history. It's like you're interlaced with our story in a beautiful and kind of strange sort of way. And so I pray that as we are looking at that today, that we will see you clearly and beautifully and in a way that inspires us to something more and different, because we know just how desperately you love us. And so we thank you for that. We thank you for your message through Luke. And I pray that we will just absorb these truths into our life so that we can live more like you. So we love you, Jesus, and we thank you in your awesome and perfect name. Amen. So my last name is Boswell, and some people think it's an English name, but it's actually a Scottish name. Any good Scots in the room with me today? A few, all right, that's good. We're amazing people because the men wear dresses. It's an amazing thing. So we are a very unique people, the Scots are, and my family immigrated here to the United States under the man Ransom Boswell. That is a cool name. I'm like, why couldn't my parents give me the name Ransom? Instead I got Matthew, right? But for some people, because I have my mother-in-law who's really into genealogy and she shares these things with me, and so I kind of learned from that. And there are definitely people who really get into genealogy, really enjoy it. They find it to be really kind of cool as far as the topic and that kind of thing. But there are other groups of people, other cultures, that the idea of a list of names that goes back in lineage, it's more than just interesting, it's vital to the narrative of their entire population. And this is something that is true when you read through the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, and you come across these long lists of names that you just sort of kind of go to the next chapter with, right? You're like, I don't know what to do with all that. You get to Numbers, you're like, that's 7 chapters of crazy. I'm just going to move on to chapter 8 or whatever it is, right? Like, we typically do that, but what you want to understand about these lineage lists is that the people of Israel, they wrote those names down and they kept track of all of this because they believed that God was going to be revealing a story through their population that would eventually end with a person that would come to rescue and reclaim the world. And so the list of names was their way of saying, here is what we've come from as we long to what we're going toward. That is the heart behind a genealogy. And so with that, as we're going into Luke today and we're going to see a genealogy, if there was any way I could try to help you understand what a genealogy really represents, it's like an old school version of 23andMe, all right? That's what it is. And there's probably been some of you that's decided to give your DNA to a company so they can know your secrets. That's your thing. I don't do that, but that's your thing. That's cool. I'm all good with that. But that's really what this list of names is all about. Now, I want to bring up the list of names in the Gospel of Luke, all right? Glorious, isn't it? It looks like a bunch of foreign words doing a word jumble amped up on, like, I don't know, Jägermeister and Red Bull or something. Like, you're like, what do I do with that entire giant list of names? And you're probably sitting there going, man, why did we come to this Sunday of all the Sundays? Like, what's Matt going to do with this? And I'll be honest, on Monday, I'm like, what am I going to do with this? I was like, man, this is the tough stuff when you go verse for verse through the Bible. It's like, well, I don't want to just bypass those verses. And so we need to address it. So we're going to do that today, but I think in a way that you're going to find interesting and kind of cool. So before I get kind of into the innards of this, I want you to understand a few things about the Gospels as it relates to these genealogies. And so you have 4 Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And only 2 of those Gospels actually have a list like this. And so Matthew has one list that starts with Abraham and then works up to Jesus. And then you have this other one in Luke that starts with Jesus and works all the way back, all the way to Adam and to God, right? So it's a different kind of list. Another thing you want to understand about the difference between these two lists is they look nothing alike when you start comparing the names. There are probably more names that are not the same than names that are the same between Matthew and Luke. And this makes people kind of wonder, like, well, why is it so different? And so there's different ways of trying to solve it. Some people will say, well, one gospel is kind of showing the line of Mary, and the other gospel is showing the line of Joseph. Or some will say that Matthew is a royal lineage, where Luke is a biological lineage, with Joseph being the adoptive stepdad or whatever, and then it kind of runs that way, And so there's different ways they try to solve it. Frankly, none of them are super clear in that, right? It's just like we have these two lists, and they sort of serve different functions, and we're not fully sure all the functions, but we're going to find some stuff that we understand as far as why they're there. The third thing I want to say about both of these lists is the fact that they are not exhaustive, all right? And what I mean by that is it is not an unbroken chain of name after name after name, but rather when we compare these lists against the Old Testament, we see that both Matthew and Luke, they jump generations, they jump a handful of names completely. They're not trying to give us this unbroken list, but rather they're giving us an example of something. And the example is trying to tie us into this unfolding story that God tells through this entire lineage. And so I think one of the safest things to do when you come across a list like this is to not get sucked into all the trees, but rather to back up and see the forest that is embedded into the story. And so that's what we're going to be doing a bit of today. We're going to look at three patterns that emerge in these lists that tell us God's big story. And so the first thing I want to start with, if you're taking notes in the app today, we already noted the 23andMe, but I want us to understand the first kind of picture we're going to learn about today is this idea that Jesus' story is an epic story, right? And that's what a genealogy is teaching. It's teaching an epic story. So if we go back and we study ancient biographies, a writer would write this kind of thing out, list all this different naming here, because they want us to know this is the pedigree of the hero, right? It was in these times, coming from this family, through these challenges, where those individuals were messy, broken, destructive, hurtful. It's in that the hero then emerges. Through that dysfunctional lineage, the hero comes into the world. And in that sense, it's very much what this is designed to do. So let me bring up this list of 78 names again. 70 of which you probably can't pronounce. I can't pronounce. We don't even want to try to pronounce, right? We knew a handful of them pretty good. But this, again, looks really overwhelming, right? And we almost don't know what to do with it. But here's the thing. If you were an Israelite and you grew up with the Old Testament being read to you and taught to you, you would be familiar with the names. And as you heard different names, it would be like a trigger that would make you think about kind of what was going on with that period of time, maybe what God was doing in light of that particular person. So I'll give you kind of a modern example. If I was to say to you, the 60s or the 90s, with just 3 syllables, the 60s, your mind is flooded with all sorts of images, of thoughts. You're thinking about dress style and music and the politics of the day. So I just had to say almost nothing, and instantly all this thought comes into your mind. Well, in the same way with these names, the Jews would be like, oh, that name, and a bunch of thought would come to mind. And so maybe what we can do with this list is we can kind of isolate some of the anchor names that would suddenly be like, whoa, that means something. See, when we do this, now we kind of realize that, oh, those are pivotal names at pivotal points in the history of God's story where God was doing major, major things in this thread of redemption, this thread of rescuing the world from its brokenness. And so what I want to do is extract all the busy names there, and let's just get down to these critical names. See, these names all kind of show a flow of something, right? So here's some things to take note of in this whole deal. First of all, in that whole genealogy, there are 2 names that are the bookends, right? Starts with Jesus and ends with God. And what we want to keep in mind with all that stuff is that the bookends are always driving the story, right? So God starts it, Jesus reclaims it, and nothing in between can mess with the story. Those are a lot of messed up people throughout. All sorts of ways in which God's story could get derailed or hijacked or destroyed, and yet God is so powerful in the mix of the story, he drives this story to this inevitable conclusion of his son. And so one of the things the genealogy tells us is that nothing could subvert what God is doing to rescue the world. He drives it through all of this chaos and bedlam to this place. And so it starts and ends with the Godhead. It always does. That's the first little thing you can see here. The second thing has to do then with David, right? So Jesus and God are the bookends. David's an interesting character. He's the prototypical character of the Messiah that's going to come one day. But here's something Luke does that's very different than Matthew. In Matthew, it goes from David to Solomon, and it follows the royal line. Luke, because he chooses a completely different variant of the genealogy, it gets to David, and then the next generation is Nathan, right? It just completely leaves the royal line. And the idea that Luke has here is almost like this thought in which when David took the throne and then David died, it's as though God said, I'm going to put pause on the line of the king, and I'm not going to follow the line of the king until the true king comes again, which is Christ. And so Luke has this idea of saying, you know what? Since David, there has not been a king on the throne for Israel until the true king of the Jews arrives. And so this is part of this epic narrative that the hero finally comes, and it's the return of the king to sit on his throne. Jesus is that return. So from this, we see that this crazy jumbled list of names tells an epic story with an epic return. Now, another name we see here is Abraham, right? And Abraham's a critical figure in the whole story because God came to Abraham and did something really, really interesting, something he also did with David, which is gave an unconditional promise, right? This idea that God said, you know what, I'm going to use you, Abraham, to raise up a future offspring through you that's going to bless the nations and change the world and undo all the mess that you see. And so that unconditional promise that was made to David, this unconditional promise made to Abraham, is embedded in this story of the lineage of Jesus. It's all kind of wrapped up in there because what God is going to do is right the world and rescue it from its problem. And what was the problem? Well, it's the curse that came through the other guy on the list, Adam. And so Jesus is the second Adam that undoes the damage caused by the first Adam. And he restores our sense of what it means to be image bearers, and he restores our relationship to the first one in the list. He restores it to God. And so you have this linear model, right? We have this whole stream through history where God establishes a plan, and he tells that plan to Adam shortly after he fails, and then he tells that plan to Abraham, even though Abraham still is a mess, and he tells that to David, though David is a train wreck, that all of them are connected to this outcome of Jesus, that God is weaving the story through broken people. And so we see that Jesus is the offspring that crushes Adam's serpent. He is the offspring that blesses Abraham's world, and he is the offspring that rules David's throne. It's an epic story, right? And for an Old Testament student that reads that genealogy, that's where their brain's going to click into. Wow, it's just this rhythmic flow, even though it's a crazy group of individuals. Now, there's another thing here that's interesting in this whole list to me. And it's weird because of all of the players throughout the Old Testament that were like major players, there is a name that is conspicuously absent in the genealogy. In fact, it's absent both in Matthew and it's absent in Luke. Does anybody want to take a guess? Moses. That is right. You came to first service, didn't you? No, I'm sure you just knew it because you're scholars. I know, right? But Moses is missing in this list. And part of this is interesting because, it's like, well, is that really on purpose? Is it not on purpose? Well, here's the thing. God conspired to subversively bring this lineage to Jesus through two different examples, right? Two different genealogies, different names, and in both, there's no Moses. Now, we could kind of go, well, that's just happenstance, that's just chance, that's whatever else. And I go, man, it could be. But Moses is such a major player. Why not embed him with the rest? Why wouldn't God just sort of engineer it for Moses to be a part of the whole narrative? And I think there's a reason for this, right? Now, this is conjecture on my part. I admit that. But I think it's conjecture with a certain sense of precedent behind it. And this is what I'm getting at. Jesus, while he was born under the law, he doesn't hail from the law, right? He's come to do something in relationship to the law, but he is altogether different than maybe what we understand about that law. And so much of this has to do with the fact that Jesus is about grace and gospel and rescue and life and freedom, where oftentimes as we read through the New Testament, we see that the law brings constraint and it brings curse. In fact, in Galatians chapter 3, Paul says, the law of Moses was introduced as a detour to the plan and the promise, right? So we see this idea here. And so God had made a promise, right? Adam, I'm going to fix the problem. Abraham, I'm going to use you to fix the problem. But the people of God get off track with that plan. They detour out. And so then God establishes the law with Moses to basically break their spirit and to remind them that they can't do this on their own. They need God's promise to do this for them. That's the spirit of the whole thing. And so part of what we have to understand, if we're a Star Wars nerd for a minute, is this straight line that is the Skywalker saga, all right? And Moses is like Solo, all right? It's a spinoff. You don't need to see it. You don't need to know it to know about the Skywalker saga. It's just on the side, but it's not the main narrative, right? And so God is telling a main narrative throughout the Old Testament, but he needs to use the law to humble the people, to get them back to the true narrative of rescue. So the writer of Hebrews gets into this, right? And they do it in an interesting way because they do it by way of contrast. Throughout Hebrews, the writer is saying there is the law and then there's Christ, right? And there is a distinctive difference. And much of what the Hebrew writer is trying to get at is this idea that God always had this priority of the gospel throughout all of human history. And that priority of the gospel is different than the function of the law. And so with this, they start off this way. It says, but now Jesus, our high priest, has been given a ministry that is far superior to the old priesthood, for he is one who mediates for us a far better covenant with God based on far better promises. If the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need for a second covenant to replace it. So the writer is talking about Moses versus Jesus here. That's what he's talking about. It says, but when God found fault with the people, he said, the day is coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. This covenant will not be like the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. Not the one on Mount Sinai, not the one with the law. It's going to be a different kind of covenant because what happened? They didn't listen to God. They didn't obey the covenant. So God turned his back on them, it says, which throws us off a little bit. Like, whoa, what do you mean God turned his back? Well, you remember last week when we talked about what is God's wrath? God's wrath is just leaving you to you, letting you do your own thing, turning his back in that sense. Well, that's what God did to Israel, right? He just turns his back because they don't want to follow him, live for him, or do the things that are prescribed in this law of Moses. Now, here's what I want you to understand about these covenants, these agreements, right? The one to Abraham was unilateral. God's just, I'm doing this. The one to David, unilateral. I'm just doing this. The one that we find in Jesus, I'm just doing this. Right? But the one that was to Moses was what we call bilateral, which is both parties come together and they both agree, I will do my part and you do your part. And if you do your part, great, and I do my part, great. But if one of us doesn't, that's a problem. And that was the law of Moses. And here's the problem with that agreement. It was very lopsided. And it's lopsided in that God can completely hold his end up, but God knows the people will not hold their end up. 613 rules, how do you think you would do, right? It's actually engineered for you to be frustrated under the fact that you can't do it. That's why it's a detour. It's a detour because the people in their pride would think, I can do this. I can earn this. I can be this. And God's like, no, you're missing the point. You need to rely completely on the promise I made to Abraham, the promise really I made back with Adam, that you need one who will do it for you because you are not equipped to do it on your own. That's the whole agenda behind it. This is why he gives the law. Again, like I said, to break them so they rely on God and his grace in their life. Therefore, the writer continues. He says, this new covenant, unlike the old one that brought demise, this new covenant will make the people of Israel on that day say to the Lord, or this is what God will do and say on that day he does this covenant. I will put my law in their minds and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God and they will be my people. And they will not need to teach their neighbors, nor will they need to teach their relatives, saying, you shall know the Lord, for everyone from the least to the greatest will already know me. And the reason for this is this new agreement brings transformation as opposed to the old agreement, which just constricts. The new agreement is all about what God will do for you, but the old agreement is what you needed to try to do for God. So the old agreement was about law. The new agreement is about grace. And in this grace, what's it say God will do? Chiefly, he says, I will forgive their wickedness and I will never again remember their sins. So under the old system, 613 ways God could keep a list of wrongs. But under this new way of Jesus, it's so potent and powerful, he doesn't even remember what you did yesterday. He does not keep a record. He does not log it for future reference. It's just like, no, they're forgiven because of Jesus. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about what the writer's getting at here. The second covenant, the second agreement, is actually the original one, just finally fulfilled. So like I said, came through Adam, through Abraham, through David, all unilateral promises that one day I will do this, and Jesus is the epicenter of that. And so we see these hints of future grace through all the characters that leads up to Jesus, fulfilling his benevolent promise. All the way through all that pain and misery and failure and struggle and exile and oppression, all of it, right? God just subversively worked. And so when we see a genealogy, especially one that goes from Jesus all the way back, we need to realize that that is just to remind us God has always been at work. Even when it doesn't look like it, even when it looks like a mess, he is at work. And that is really the first lesson of a genealogy. The second lesson, though, I think is dramatically connected to the first. And this is the reality that Jesus' story is a human interest story, right? It's a human interest story. Because God was so interested in us, he was willing to send his son to be like one of us, right? He embeds himself into our situation. He becomes a part of our story. He doesn't just stand over the top of it and manage the story. He says, no, I want entry into the story. And part of entering into the story is entering into the mess that is the story. And when you look at this heritage of Jesus and his family, it's nothing but mess, man. When we looked at the Luke one, man, those characters were terrible. Abraham, sex trafficked his wife twice. David was a thug who did some really terrible things. I mean, these people were a mess. Adam, of course, we know his story. So that's a part of his line. But when you go and look at the Gospel of Matthew, you see another really long list, right? And you're like, what are we going to do with that one now, right? But if we look for some of the anchor names and we highlight them in yellow, we see an interesting feature from Matthew that's not in Luke. Peppered throughout are these 5 names, all females. And if we isolate those 5 names for just a minute and we think about maybe what they're about, you see the mess, right? That first name, Tamar, right? She was a woman who was denied her legal right for a child through her husband. Her first husband died. Then she marries the brother, and he doesn't want to have a child, so God actually kills that guy. And so she's so distraught, and she knows that she is worthy of having a child from that family, that she literally dresses up as a prostitute to fake her father-in-law into having sex with her and impregnating her. That is like a soap opera. Like, I didn't even write that. Matter of fact, you don't want your kids to read Genesis 38. You're like, whoa, we're going to skip that. We're going to go right to 39, right? It's like that risque. But what's amazing in that is God then looks at her and says, and she was righteous for what she did. You're like, whoa, what? It's a super messy story. But oftentimes, part of that mess is that men weren't kind of living up to what they should do, and she was just left to do whatever she could do to kind of make things work. It's a messy story, but it's a weird story, and that God says she was righteous by faking to be a prostitute. Super weird. Or maybe the next one, Rahab. She was just actually a prostitute, right? And the Jewish spies come into her city, and she hides them, which means they were putting her at risk with her own culture. And then she lies about having them. So she's both the prostitute, that lies. And yet in the end, this is all a part of God's plan. And God says she's a righteous woman for what she did, even though you're like, whoa, she was a pagan prostitute that did what? What are we talking about? And then eventually she does convert to Judaism, but it's such a weird, convoluted story. Or who do we have next in the list? Ruth. Oh, well, she's okay. Well, Ruth is okay, but she was another pagan, converts to Judaism. But she did some things to win Boaz that almost every scholar will say, kind of unseemly for a woman of her time. Questionable. And then you had men kind of bartering over who had authority over her to own her as like family property. I mean, it's a crazy story. Bathsheba, I don't even know if we need to comment on that. We all know the story of Bathsheba. What we sometimes forget is she's really a part of that hashtag Me Too movement. Somebody with authority demands that they come to the palace and has an agenda, right? Like, how could she say no? And it results in the death of her husband and the death of the child that was created from that illicit relationship. I mean, it's just all crazy. Now, at least Mary, she's the good one here. But she's the unwed teen unexpected pregnancy person, which certainly would have been judged in her society for such things. See, all of this is to say, man, this is messy stuff. These 5 women had scandal and pain attached to their lives, oftentimes, like I said, at the hands of men who weren't trying to live up to their responsibilities and expectations. Yet all of this kind of foreshadows to me the very people Jesus was coming for. Right? In fact, in Mark chapter 2, it says he walked along and he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in his tax collector's booth. And so he said, follow me and be my disciple. So he followed Jesus, right? It says later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to a home where the dinner guests had other tax collectors and other disreputable sinners, because there was many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. But when the teachers of religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the tax collectors and the other sinners, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with such scum? See, this is interesting because religion oftentimes wants to act like it's loyal to God by looking down on others that they think are unworthy. Like, I'm looking out for God by pointing out the problems of other broken people, missing the fact that God is so interested in broken people, he sends his son to be their friend. Right? And more than that, I can't help but think Jesus comes to these very people because Jesus knows that is my dysfunctional family. Right? My whole lineage is people like that. Jesus is awesome about knowing who he comes for. He comes for those who know that they are lost. Right? They don't think they're achieving the law. They know they fail at achieving the law. They're humbled by that reality, and they need the grace of God. That's who he comes for. The leaders, they don't see it. They think they got it figured out, so they just point out the flaws of everybody else. But Jesus comes because we are all flawed. His family was dysfunctional, and frankly, every one of us is dysfunctional. And that's why he comes for us as well. That leads us to the third kind of principle of the story, and that is that Jesus' story becomes your never-ending story, right? Now, right now, the fans of Stranger Things are like, oh, the song's in my head. I will not shake this out for the rest of the day, all right? But here's what's really cool. In Matthew and Luke, the list of names either begins or ends with Jesus, right? So he's bookended in some fashion. But there's another genealogy list where he's really the center of the list. He's like the epicenter of an entire list of names that are critical in the storytelling, right? And so, again, it's in Hebrews, and the writer is contrasting the superiority of Jesus over Moses, of grace over law, and this is what he says. He says to the Christians, he says, you have not come to a physical mountain, to a place of flame and fire and darkness and gloom and whirlwind, as the Israelites did at Mount Sinai. You haven't come to the place where the law was given. He says, that's not what you've come to. No, he says, you've come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to a countless thousands of angels in joyful gathering. You have come to the assembly of God's firstborn children, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God. You are in Christ's genealogy now. You are in the list of God's family. You are among his kids, right? Because of Jesus, you have been gathered into that. Your name is a part of that lineage because of Jesus. This is why it says you've come to Jesus, the one who mediates a new covenant between God and people, and to the sprinkling of blood, which speaks of forgiveness instead of crying out for vengeance like the blood of Abel. That might be a weird ending for us, but here's what it means. Instead of Jesus' bloodshed requiring justice against us, because really we shed it, it's saying Jesus' bloodshed brought forgiveness because he paid the justice for us. So there is no crying out for justice because Jesus was our justice. This is why Paul says, so now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all of God's holy people. You are members of God's family. So the next time you're reading through your Bible and you come across those big, long genealogies, just remember your name is now inside that genealogy. You are a part of the family because that was God's epic story, to send his son into our dysfunction because he had such a profound passion for us that he wanted us to be a part of his never-ending story. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, I thank you that we can come across these weird, obscure lists of names, and then we just kind of mine it out a little bit when we take some time to run the little red string throughout the Bible. We see that it was a thread of redemption. It was this winding, crazy, broken, messy, oftentimes hateful or foolish process that was really your wisdom for the world. And so I thank you for so rich a grace. I thank you that nothing can thwart your plan. And I pray when we feel like our lives are as messy as the Old Testament, that we will remember you are always with us in that mess. And you are always steering our lives to your ultimate conclusions. And so we thank you and we praise you for your faithfulness to us in your good name. Amen.